We're now going to go to Cherry Smiley. Cherry Smiley is from Canada. She's a feminist, artist, and researcher from the Nlaka Mux and Dene nations. She is currently PhD candidate in the Communications Studies program at Concordia University in Montreal and founder and executive director of Women's Studies Online. She's going to talk about putting women back into women's studies. Thank you so much for coming, Cherry, and over to you.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take some excerpts from my thesis that is almost finished, tell you a little bit about my journey as an Indigenous woman feminist in Canada, going through, the academia and getting, pushed out the other side and what's happened as a result of that. My name is Cherry Smiley. I come from the Inuktitut Thompson Nation, which is in British Columbia, Canada. That's where my mother and my grandmother are from. And my father's nation is the Navajo Nation, the Dene Nation, from the southwestern United States. So I began a PhD in communication studies at Concordia University in Montreal in 2015. I came to academia through feminist frontline anti-violence work, and that was at Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter, where I gave support, information, and advocacy to women who had been assaulted by men. And this is where I learned to organize as well and advocate with Indigenous and non-Indigenous feminist groups to end prostitution. This important work provided a feminist foundation for my research, although I had started developing my research questions much earlier without knowing it. My research actually began when I was very small and continued very messy and painfully with my own direct and indirect experiences with the statistical horror stories told about Indigenous women in Canada. So Indigenous women in Canada are more likely to be, we're basically more targeted by men for all different forms of male violence, whether that be women abuse in the home, prostitution, incest, being disappeared, being murdered. So there's a crisis of murdered and disappeared Indigenous women in Canada. Although I didn't, when I was younger, have a frame to make sense of or the words to explain what I was experiencing at the time, this is when I began to ask questions about the world around me. I kept asking questions about all this male violence and poverty and disability, drug addiction, alcoholism. And it wasn't until I was introduced to feminist theory as an undergraduate university student that I began to find and imagine some answers to my questions that made sense. And it wasn't until I became active in the women's liberation movement as a frontline anti-violence worker and activist that I was able to actually apply and build feminist theory in action. So when I began this PhD journey at Concordia University in Montreal, I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew that ground had already been broken for feminist research in academia by the courageous feminist women who had come before. So women like Mary Daly and Renate Klein and Sheila Jeffries, these incredible women, Janice Raymond, who had really helped to start women's studies in universities. So I knew that there was space for that. And I firmly believed that I could maintain that space and maybe even expand that little bit of wiggle room that radical feminists had created in academia with the development of women's studies programs in the 1970s. This wiggle room had given me confidence in the validity and the usefulness of feminist methodology and theory in the Manstitution of University. It allowed me to imagine pursuing a research project that I felt was important in a way that made sense to me. In 2015, I set about this PhD journey with the intention of using Indigenous feminist theory to examine the prostitution of Indigenous women in Canada as a process of ongoing colonization. So given Canada had just come through a constitutional challenge to prostitution laws that resulted in the 2014 Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which is an unfinished, I would say, version of the Nordic model, but not quite, but headed in the right direction. And that the long-awaited national inquiry into murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls had began in 2016. That I thought looking at these connections between prostitution and Indigenous women was urgent. And it was a moment, and it has been, the last decade or so, a moment where the Canadian public and Canadian governments have been paying more attention to these issues. I would say that I began this PhD program aware of the difficulties of doing feminist research, but excited and hopeful at the revolutionary possibilities feminism offered to academia, research, and to communities of women everywhere, including Indigenous women. At the other end of this PhD journey, I have concluded that academia is terrible and I hate it. And the general consensus is that the feeling is mutual. Academia as it stands and I are not a good fit for each other. Actually, we're incompatible. But in the course of completing my doctoral degree, I learned quite a few things, which I guess is the point. So in that case, Doctor of Philosophy, mission accomplished. I learned things I didn't expect to learn, and I hear that's quite common in these kinds of adventures, or at least it should be. As I read more, thought more, did more, spoke with more women, and watched the actions of women and others around me, I realized about 2/3 of the way into my research project that I had been doing my research upside down. I had made a big mistake. What I'd done was too easily accept Indigenous theorizing about the concepts of colonization and Indigenous feminism in Canada without considering, as Robin Morgan has stated, that these concepts have been defined and theorized by men. And I didn't consider what these sex-based blind spots might mean for Indigenous women. So as my research continued, I realized there were significant contradictions that I couldn't account for, such as the high rates of Indigenous men who are also committing violence against Indigenous women, as an example. And so in order to use Indigenous feminist theory to look at the prostitution of Indigenous women as a process of ongoing colonization, I had to take a few giant steps backwards and reevaluate my work, my beliefs, what I knew and what I thought I knew. Turns out I needed to redefine colonization and Indigenous feminism as if women matter as much as men do. So this meant not assuming women's interests as a class were considered or included in male-centered Indigenous theorizing. This meant asking uncomfortable questions like, what does colonization and Indigenous feminism actually mean? Is there one meaning or different meanings? Is Indigenous feminism different from feminism, and how so? And who came up with all these concepts anyways? It became clear that I had no clear answers to these questions and that I clearly needed to clearly define these concepts as part of my research. In other words, I needed to create a female-centered and feminist definition of colonization and subsequently of Indigenous feminism in order to rigorously examine the prostitution of Indigenous women in Canada. And by building on the work of feminist theorists such as Renate Klein, Mary Daly, Adrienne Rich, Kathleen Berry, Sheila Jeffries, Diane Bell, Audre Lorde, Andrea Dworkin, Maria Mize, Patricia Hill Collins, Anne Stoller, and many others, this is what I did. So I recall having a meeting with my supervisor, who's she's been a wonderful support, and she's an incredible academic. Towards the end of this journey, and I was tired. I was really, really tired. A PhD is a long haul journey, and I had hauled longer than I wanted to already. Life kept getting in the way. Life from before, life from now, and it was a lot to deal with. Too much sometimes, if I'm being honest. I almost gave up on a few different occasions, but here I am, coming out the other side. My supervisor and I were talking about my sprint to the thesis finish line, and I said something to her along the lines of, I need to sprint to the finish because I need to get this done before someone else dies, meaning before someone else is taken by overdose or goes missing or gets hurt, before another crisis stops me in my tracks. The next day, it was announced that a mass unmarked grave containing the bodies of 215 children were found at the site of the former Kamloops Indian residential school. And so I'm from that area. I have family members that went to that school. And what happened was, again, everything, my life kind of slowed to a crawl. That hit me really hard. And so this is what universities can do to decolonize. They make all these claims about how they're decolonizing and indigenizing, but they're not actually doing that. And what they can do is they can accommodate for the impacts of colonization on Indigenous women that result in crisis after crisis after crisis in our lives, in the lives of our loved ones, and in the lives of Indigenous women generally. So cultural activities such as dreamcatcher workshops and beading circles are all well and good, but they're an easy answer and an insufficient one to actually support Indigenous scholars, as are all the well-meaning statements of solidarity. In the end, I suppose, dead children are easier to respond to than live ones. My PhD journey meant stopping and starting, sometimes sprinting, crawling, sometimes falling on my face, and sometimes crying and screaming from anger and frustration as I navigated all manners of roadblocks and detours. This dissertation feels alive as I am at times, and sometimes that's not very. Starting and finishing a PhD is tough work by itself, but when a scholar takes a feminist position on controversial issues such as prostitution and gender, the task becomes almost insurmountable, almost. It's important that I tell the story of my PhD as honestly as possible, and this includes sharing the mental, emotional, and physical harm that has been done to me because of the feminist positions I take on political issues that disproportionately impact women, issues such as prostitution and gender, and their corresponding legal and policy implications. When I think of my PhD adventure, the hostile territories in which I passed through and which I continue to work immediately come to mind. The issue is not that most academics disagree with the feminist position that, for example, prostitution is a form of male violence against women. It's that most academics and the culture of academia in Canada and elsewhere believe that it's entirely unacceptable and even harmful to question the idea that sex work is work, and that it's actually an act of violence to hold the feminist position that prostitution is a form of male violence against women. In academia, feminists who take this position shouldn't be challenged or debated. They shouldn't be heard at all. And so it's in this hostile environment that my research lives. So I'm running out of time a little bit, right? I think, yes. So
you've got 3 minutes.
Okay.
You have 3 minutes. Yeah.
Right on. Okay, thank you. So as Maria Mize explains, as feminist scholars, we have to start fighting against women's exploitation and oppression in order to be able to understand the extent, the dimensions, the forms and causes of this patriarchal system, which she also refers to as, if you want to know a thing, you must change it. So as a result, basically, I ended up writing a lot. I made video diaries. Initially, I was going to make a documentary on prostitution, but as well, I participated throughout my PhD. I participated in conferences. I was kicked out of conferences. I engaged in public scholarship and was defamed and attacked on social media, including by distinguished professors. I attended rallies, signed petitions, helped women find lawyers, helped women get their kids safe from their fathers, and helped women make safety plans and leave battering relationships. I made missing persons reports. I spoke to governments and to the media and to the public about the issues women, and particularly Indigenous women, confront in a patriarchy. So I was and am active in the women's liberation movement. And this has been such an important part of my research. And so I'm not done, I'm almost done. So I'm hopefully, fingers crossed, defending in December. But what's great about this, and I'll end with this, I think, hopefully on a hopeful note, is as a part of doing my research, what I did was I founded Women's Studies Online in 2019. And so basically we, based in Canada with global impact, Women's Studies Online is a platform for decolonizing feminist research, education, action, and community building. Women's Studies Online is informed and inspired by the radical politics that initially guided the creation of women's studies programs in universities across Canada and elsewhere. Women's Studies Online builds on feminist theory to help women make sense of our lives and takes action by organizing with women for our collective liberation. We provide women with theoretical tools, practical skills, and a political network where we can further our feminist thinking, organizing, and action. And so basically, Women's Studies Online is what my thesis looks like when it's activated. And it came about directly in response to the frustration and the anger and the roadblocks that I was confronting as a feminist Indigenous woman trying to do feminist research in a university. And so we have a small team. We managed to get some funds, which is great. We've done amazing lectures in the past. We've had Tamarack Verrill, Renate Klein, Julie Bindel, and others. So we now have this small team, and we are growing exponentially. It's fantastic. We're about to launch our new website. And so basically we provide membership-based courses, exclusive lectures, workshops. We're going to have a feminist book club as well. We have an events calendar and a reference list. And so I can put the link, or maybe somebody can share the link, hopefully in the chat. So as I said, we're just building this new website. We have this wonderful small team of amazing women that are working on this, and women that have volunteered and worked on it in the past and now as well. So it's very exciting to be able to create something that can actually give women some critical thinking tools. And